Welcome to Stories from the Museum. I'm Richard LaFrancis, and I'm director of the Pappy Boynton Veterans Museum. These are stories that we have about artifacts right here at the Pappy Boynton Veterans Museum in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, birthplace of legendary Marine fighter pilot and flying tiger, Pappy Boynton. Our goal is to preserve the stories of everyday Americans who have served our nation in order to give us the freedoms that we currently enjoy. Today's episode is about Sergeant Earl Mcnutt. Sergeant Mcnutt represents tens of thousands of Americans who died in combat, whose stories are generally not told. His story would have vanished into the mists of history if not for a remarkable set of circumstances which you will learn about now. And if you're wondering why I'm wearing a World War II Japanese high-altitude flight suit, I'll try and tie that together at the end of the episode. That have come in almost by serendipity. For example, several years ago, I was closing up the museum when we had our old location, and there was a pickup truck parked in front of the museum. I walked outside to the people. I said, "Hey, are you looking for the museum?" And they said, "Oh, yeah, we're camped out north of town here. We came specifically in to see the Pappy Boynton Veterans Museum." I said, "Well, we're pretty much closed up, but as long as you came in, I'll just go ahead and open it up and give you another tour." So that's what we did. After about an hour and a half tour of the place, they were very happy and left. About a month later, we got a package in the mail. Inside the package looked like a high school or college yearbook, and it said "My Service Record," and it had Earl Mcnutt, his name embossed in gold on the front of it. Inside of it was a short handwritten history of that particular book. The Marys from Linwood, Washington, had been previously living in Chico, California, when Robert was out in his front yard and a garbage truck pulled up in front. Garbage man got out and brought this thing over to him, handed it to him, and it was this service record book that sanitation specialist said he didn't believe it should be in the dump, and he found it in the garbage can and asked him if he could find a good home for it. So the Marys attempted to have other museums take it. Nobody was interested. So they ended up later on moving to Linwood, Washington, but they brought the book with them. And so 20 years after the garbage man found it in the dump, they took a tour of the Pappy Boynton Veterans Museum and ended up just mailing it to us because they felt they'd found a home for it. Now, this particular book here is something that we have not seen before, but apparently they had a lot of them because it's pretty professionally done. We think that the Earl's sister compiled this after his passing, but you could see from the contents that there was an awful lot of affection and respect from his co-workers, people that knew him as a manager of the Boston store. What he was involved with was the invasion of the Philippines, which is nominally called the Battle of Leyte Gulf, where the famous "I shall return" happened with MacArthur. It's one of the biggest battles of World War II. It was the first kamikaze attack. It had the last battle between battleships in history, had probably the largest naval battle in history. Over 200,000 naval personnel in everything from carriers to destroyers all the way down from both the Imperial Navy and the United States and Allied navies. In addition to that, after a whole series of major naval battles, which you could go on the net or go to the library and do the research, it's absolutely amazing how much loss there was just on all factors, and that's just the naval part. The actual amphibious landing on the Philippines was enormous in the first days of battle. Well, the Navy lost over 3,000 men just in the battle, almost 5,000 seriously injured. That's before the Army went ashore. The Army losses were over 16,000 men killed and over 55,000 injured. And of course, that's not slight injuries. So It was a very major deal. On the second day, Sergeant Earl Mcnutt was with the 722nd Depot Corps 2, stacking ammunition after the initial landing and bombs and whatnot. A Japanese bomber came in, and the pilot dropped the bomb, hit the ammunition, and it literally pulverized about 70 of the 90 people working at the compound. Of course, the other 20 or so were seriously injured. So it was a horrible thing. They trained for over a year, and just in 2 days he was gone. And then what happened is kind of a mystery, because he had no family. It ended up his sister putting together this service record. It probably stayed with his parents, probably a spot of reverence and memory there at their house. And then after they passed away, it probably went to his sibling, and then after 70 years plus years, it ended up in maybe a great niece or great nephew or something, and they had no idea who it was other than a family member that was killed in some war in the past. They had to move someplace, and next thing you know, it was gone, until the guy driving the garbage truck just happened to see it in the garbage can and pull it out, and it ended up at our museum. And we now are telling the story. Because it came to the museum, it actually started taking legs of its own. Researcher Dale Childers uncovered an awful lot of interesting things regarding the Battle of Leyte Gulf. But let's back up here a little bit. This enormous battle here, it seems to be lost in the mists of history. This major and epic, huge operation in which Sergeant Mcnutt gave his life. Just not only the American death and casualties and huge loss of ships and carriers and cruisers, the Japanese also lost 3 battleships and carriers and destroyers. And in the land battle itself, of the 530,000 Japanese soldiers there at the beginning of the invasion, 420,000 plus were killed. That's an enormous amount of people. Just think how many engineers or doctors and scientists potentially were killed right there on their side, let alone ours. The Japanese commander was General Tomoyuki Yamashita. He was nicknamed the Tiger of Malaya, because what he did was, he actually, with 70,000 troops, managed to capture British and defeat the British at Malaya and Singapore. And Winston Churchill called that the worst defeat in British military history. That was pretty an amazing thing. He was a very good tactician. His problem, which actually was probably good for us, is the fact that he was a rival of General Tojo. He came out second best with the Emperor, and instead of leading Japanese sources and resources against the Allied and American efforts, he was basically relegated to the Philippines, which had already been conquered. He got in there after the notorious Bataan Death March, Corregidor, all of that. But nonetheless, he was charged with those crimes, and he actually was hung in 1946 as a war criminal, even though there was never any proof that he actually had anything to do with that. But to summarize this whole thing, this battle is one of the most amazing things, and his life was not given up in vain. That Japanese bomber that came in, it was just plain old lucky. There's a lot of other people along with Sergeant Mcnutt who were also unlucky, and we should really appreciate what they've donated and given to our country for these liberties that we have. Another aspect of this entire episode is the fact that Sergeant Mcnutt and 70 other Americans were literally blown up by this massive ammunition dump fire after the Japanese bomber dropped a bomb right on it. Something people probably just want to ignore is what happens to those people that are blown into pieces. We've discovered that he was basically put back together and shipped to Hawaii and turned there. And then, 1953 or so, they took his remains. He was buried at the National Cemetery in San Bruno, California. But as our tech research ace Dale Childers came up with the methodology of this and actually contacted the people that were involved with this procedure. It's very interesting, required a lot of work, and those people, our hats are off to them that do this gruesome task. So there you go. I've got to mention somebody that is very central to this very gruesome work here of doing the honorable and respectful notations of all of our service people that were really blown to pieces. And that person is Mildred Trotter. She was an anthropologist at Schofield Barracks in Oahu. She helped come up with different ways of identifying all these remains, and a lot of it was from mass graves, and she was asked to identify the remains from all those service people that were on the Arizona. It's virtually impossible. Nowadays we have DNA and all that stuff, but in those days it was far from it. She spent 14 months developing this technique for the Central Identification Laboratory of American Graves Registration. So hats off to her, as well as everybody else that has been involved with the project of preserving the dignity. And about this flight jacket, if you believe in the 5 degrees of separation, what if the Japanese pilot was flying that bomber that dropped the bomb that killed 70 Americans, including Sergeant Earl Mcnutt, was wearing this jacket, which was brought back to the United States as a souvenir by a GI in Japan? If you want to help to continue these stories, please donate to the button below so that we can continue.